Good morning. I am Dr. Roger Sneed, the Dorothy and B.H. Peace Jr. Associate Professor of Religion and Chair at Furman University. I'm going to present a brief lecture on Black liberation theology and connecting it to Black Lives Matter. For James Cone, the founder of Black liberation theology, as he framed it in the 1970s and 80s, Black liberation theology is theologically shouting Black folks into existence. Black liberation theology is an affirmation of Blackness in terms of Black identity, experiences, history, and culture against white supremacist power structures. Black liberation theology is an affirmation of the rightness of Black struggles for freedom and self-determination. Cone's theology of liberation is concerned with the problem of human sin and human dignity. Racism and white supremacy is America's great sin in that it denies the dignity of Black people and elevates white identity above that of any other race. Such a denial of human dignity is antithetical to the Christian gospel. For Cone, the gospel of Christ as it relates to humanity should be a message of liberation from oppression. Human beings, therefore, have an ethical responsibility to help bring about liberation, and any other type of action by human beings that does not facilitate liberation is, in Cone's estimation, sinful. Cone is concerned with those theological categories that can apply to human beings, such as sin, grace, liberation, etc. All of these are important for Cone. Again, Cone's focus on the human being is rooted in his argument that Black liberation theology is an existential theology. For Cone, Christian theology is passionate. If it cannot speak to those experiences that form human life, then it is a dead theology and not worthy of our consideration. The humanity of Christ and the divinity of Christ are both connected to a passion for liberating humanity from oppression. At the beginning of his book, A Black Theology of Liberation, Cone states, quote, "Christian theology is a theology of liberation. It is a rational study of the being of God in the world in light of the existential situation of an oppressed community, relating the forces of liberation to the essence of the gospel, which is Jesus Christ," end quote. And I'll point to another quote of Cone's. Quote, "The basic mistake of our white opponents is their failure to see that God did not become a universal human being, but an oppressed Jew, thereby disclosing to us that both human nature and divine nature are inseparable from oppression and liberation. To know who the human person is to focus on the oppressed one and what he does for an oppressed community as it liberates itself from slavery," end quote. Thus, we must ask ourselves what Black liberation theology can say in this moment. What can Black liberation theology say in the moment of Black Lives Matter? Here, we can turn to Cone's claim that God is Black. The God of Black liberation theology is configured so that God is not only intimately concerned with the well-being of Black people, but also intends the liberation of Black people in this world. For Cone and other Black liberation theologians, God and Jesus are virtually one and the same. This is itself part of Protestant Christian theologies that often relate God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit as being one. Jesus Christ is presented as the physical manifestation of God's activity on behalf of the oppressed. As such, both Jesus and God are intimately connected to those who are oppressed and downtrodden by racist and later classist and sexist societies. God is an entity concerned with justice and sides with and acts on behalf of the oppressed. As such, God is Black. God's Blackness and identification with the oppressed creates certain moral obligations for humanity. What Cone is setting up in his descriptions of God as Black is an ethical argument. If white people claim to love God, then they are bound by a duty to live faithfully according to the divine will. Part of that will, then, is to act decisively on the side of the oppressed. God is not neutral. As such, neither can human beings be neutral, nor can human beings favor a love that places no moral obligations upon its adherents. Those who would continue to support a political and social structure that does not allow for Black people to experience human flourishing are characterized as oppressors. Those who seek human flourishing and advancement of Black interests, namely freedom from oppression, are those who are on God's side. Thus, Black liberation theology is the theological expression of God's love on behalf of Blackness. Black liberation theology's claim that God is Black means that God's Blackness, that is, God's identification with the oppressed through the revelation of Jesus Christ, is explicitly an affirmation that Black lives matter. And because Black lives matter to God, it is the moral obligation of those who claim to follow Christ to work on behalf of Black lives and to dismantle white supremacy.